I love coming down to the border. I think of it as coming down to the border. It's really not coming down at all. It's just going to a different place. But as I always say to folks when I come down, the number one thing is, of course, just the warmth of the people down here. I live in Washington, and I'm an Englishman by birth, so I'm pretty cold-blooded. But Washington is one of the coldest places I've ever lived in my life, I have to say. But when the first question anybody asks you is, what do you do for a living? And if that's not interesting to them, they move on. And you think, these are not human beings, I tell you. And it's not like that here. People are interested in you. They want to know your backstory. They want to know where you're from. They want to know about your family. And that's a wonderful thing. The second thing is this, is that in Washington, we talk about the border. We talk about the bilateral relationship. We talk about nearshoring, reshoring. We talk about infrastructure, but we talk. We don't actually do it. I learned something recently from a colleague who said to me, if you're somebody who can actually do things in Washington, you're like gold, because everybody wants to come up with brilliant ideas and not actually implement them. The fact is that when you come down to places like Brownsville, these are communities of doers. These are people who are actually living the bilateral relationship. They're living economic development. They're living nearshoring and reshoring. This is what the reality is here in Brownsville. So my presentation today focuses on sort of from the very high level. Let me see if I can get forward here. There we go. From the very high level of geopolitics down to the local level. And we live, obviously, in highly turbulent times. I'm just going to set my timer here so that I don't go over. Highly turbulent times, enormous amounts of change. I mean, over the past few years, of course, we've seen the shift during the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the realignment of supply chains, enormous disruption. China-US rivalry is at unprecedented levels. There are efforts being made internationally to try to calm things down, to do a little bit of a reset in the relationship. But it's clear that we are now in the period of a new Cold War. And I don't mean a Cold War like the one that we had with the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century. This is a Cold War where both economies are so deeply integrated that it's very difficult to disentangle them. Nonetheless, politicians and some businesses are trying to do that. And it's a costly affair, and it's going to take a lot of time, but it also opens up enormous possibilities for other parts of the world. The geopolitical threats that we've seen over the past 12 months in particular, or 15 months in particular with Ukraine and Russian aggression there, are something that most people didn't predict. They didn't think it would be going this route. We've learned now that we need to be prepared to respond, not just militarily, but economically to those threats. That means that projects like LNG in Brownsville now have potential to have a geopolitical impact around the world. The Europeans desperately need energy. They got through one winter. They're not looking forward to the next winter. And so the opportunities, and indeed I would say the responsibilities of the United States as an energy exporter have just increased. We've seen the decoupling, de-risking, diversification conversation. Early in the Biden administration, we talked about decoupling from China. As I said, it's very difficult to disentangle. And in fact, it's probably not in our economic interest to do that 100%. So we shifted from a language or a narrative of decoupling to de-risking. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then we've moved from that to a conversation about resilience and diversification, meaning that we probably still need China for a lot of things, at least in the short to medium term. But there are some things which we would rather move elsewhere. And most importantly, we cannot put all of our eggs in one basket anymore. Yes, it's fine to still trade with China, but we can't rely on them 100% for any one thing, because that exposes us to vulnerabilities that we should not be comfortable with, and we've been comfortable with for far too long. And this brings me to the point about the way that we have realigned our thinking on supply chains. For the last 2.5 years at the Wilson Center, my project has been to understand US supply chains and US supply chain strategy and policies. And we've been working very closely with the private sector. We have a supply chain working group of about 30 companies from across the United States and Canada that have been talking to us about what they're doing to shift their thinking on supply chains. And it's not just the diversification and supply chain resilience. There's a longer term change here. It is essentially the shift from what we call value for money, where we were happy to produce something across the other side of the world if it saved us 5 cents on a widget, to now saying, actually, the price is not necessarily the cost. And so we need to think about the values that are built into the production model. So do we really want to produce something cheaply that is produced in China by political prisoners? Do we want to accept that anymore? And we don't. We've enacted national legislation that forces companies to be much more conscious of where their imports are coming from and to avoid forced labor. We've also begun to think, of course, about ESG, and ESG has become a highly controversial topic in recent months. But the fact is that if we look at ESG in a longer historical perspective, it's a development of the concept of corporate social responsibility. It's about due diligence. It's about actually making sure that we as consumers, we as producers, and we as shareholders feel comfortable with the business model. And we should be asking those questions, because if we just go for the value for money argument, we're going to be imposing and incurring costs that are perhaps unexpected and unforeseen today, but that will come back and haunt us in the future. So I like to say that we've moved from a focus on value to a focus on values. And perhaps the most important value today is that of national security and of geoeconomics and geopolitics. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, very recently gave a speech at the Brookings Institution in Washington. And in that speech, he essentially laid out what is the Biden Doctrine. And the Biden Doctrine is a move away from unfettered free trade, unfettered integrated production with wherever it's cheapest to do so, in particular China, to a much more conscious approach to production. That we need to think more about how trade and investment impacts not just other countries, but how it impacts here in the United States. It's a worker-centric trade policy that is focused on bringing employment back to the United States, protecting workers' rights here in the United States and abroad, because if you don't do it in other countries, then of course the investment is going to go there. And essentially, it's going against what myself and many other people have proposed for decades now, which is that the free trade approach is the way to go because that's the most efficient approach. But it's not just the Biden administration that's argued this. If you go back to the Trump administration before, it was very much the same approach to international trade. Having this new paradigm on geoeconomics and geopolitics, that we are now in a global competition and we need to make sure that the United States is prepared nationally and also in conjunction with its partners around the world, that has now crossed administrations. It crosses both parties. Both parties are highly suspicious now of free trade. Thank the Lord that we got the USMCA passed during the previous administration, because that's the last free trade agreement that we're going to see for a long, long time in Washington. We will see economic cooperation agreements. We'll see economic framework agreements. We will see trade facilitation, none of which are bad, but we won't see a full-scale, full-blown FTA in the near future. That Biden Doctrine has been followed up at home in terms of federal legislation with a number of key pieces of legislation. The bipartisan infrastructure law, then we've had the CHIPS and Science Act, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. Literally trillions of dollars of public investment. The Inflation Reduction Act alone, people quote the number of $379 billion that will go in tax credits. That's what they estimate it'll be. There's no cap on it. If more people buy electric vehicles than we thought they would, that could possibly go up to $800 billion in public investment into this particular sector, which means that US automobile companies right now, US mining companies, US critical minerals processing companies are all doing very well. Look at the Chips and Science Act. The Chips and Science Act, what's regularly quoted, is $52 billion to incentivize investment in semiconductors here in the United States. A lot of that money is going to places like Arizona, for example. Some of it's coming here to Texas. But alongside the chips part of that is the science part. Another $80 to $180 billion into science and research here in the United States. This is a conscious effort to make the United States more competitive. I'm actually greatly encouraged. Although this goes against some of my economic thinking, I'm greatly encouraged to see that in a short period of time, the United States has turned itself around from a country which said, just let the markets do their work, to a country that says, we can't just let the markets do their work. We need to take a role as government. And the government needs to actually provide some incentives, not just sticks, but carrots. We're in the era of industrial policy, something that I never thought I would say here in the United States. And you can believe what you like about industrial policy, but in fact, when we see what happened last year, the hundreds of billions of dollars that have already gone into the economy, it's moving the needle. What I always say about the Inflation Reduction Act is that it was a seismic event. The ground, the terrain has shifted. And look at how private investment is now following that. And where is private investment going in response to the Inflation Reduction Act? Here within the United States, it's going to the places in the United States where it makes sense to do business. That is largely Republican-controlled states. Although this is a Democrat-sponsored bill by a Democratic administration that was not really that bipartisan, it's Republican states that are benefiting from it. It's part of the genius of the IRA, to be honest with you, from a political perspective, because it means that a future Republican administration is not going to want to roll this back because of all the benefits that have come from for their states from it. Internationally, where is money flowing after the Inflation Reduction Act? It's flowing to countries with whom the United States already has a free trade agreement or can claim status equivalent to free trade agreement. The immediate reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act in countries like Korea, Japan, the European Union, Great Britain, etc., was shock, horror. How can the United States do this without consulting us? And the truth is that the United States didn't necessarily consult with them, but everybody knew what was happening, what was coming. If you didn't think it was ever going to pass as a piece of legislation, that was your mistake as a political analyst. But everybody then came to the table with the United States and negotiated and said, what can we give you to allow us to access those same tax credits so that our goods, our inputs into the production process count for those tax credits for electric vehicles? And so we've seen deals with Korea. We've seen deals with Japan. We're working on a deal with the European Union. Even Argentina, a country with whom we don't have particularly strong relations, they're negotiating with the United States. The power of the purse and the power of being the world's largest single economy has come back again to help the United States. And this is one of the truths that was revealed by the Trump administration, is that if you're the big dog in the room, then you get to dictate terms. And the Biden administration, at least on this issue, has followed that example and is doing a very good job of pushing its allies and partners to say, we want to work with you, but you're going to need to adapt. You're going to need to work with us in exchange. So this brings us to Mexico. As I said, thank goodness that we got the USMCA approved, because having a 21st century free trade agreement with the United States is now kind of the platinum level of friendship, allies, partnership with the United States. And if you look at what Mexico has to offer, and this is a beautiful chart that I took from IHS Markit, which actually looks at the different regions of the United States. Of course, it's general by definition, but if you look at the northern border, and they've tried to group it all together, but the strengths, immediate vicinity to the United States, strong manufacturing presence, large talent pool, business-friendly local governments, the risks, high levels of water stress, strong criminal presence. We all know that about northern Mexico. I think what they're missing from this is the fact that whilst the border states on the Mexican side of the border have enormous strengths and enormous potential, so much more needs to go into questions of infrastructure, energy, human capital development, and of course, solving some very basic issues of availability of water and real estate. When you look at how the economic growth projections for the United States in general have been revised upwards just today, we're seeing new figures coming out that we're expecting to have 2.4% growth here in the United States, which is up significantly from, I think it was the 1.6% that we were predicting earlier on. Mexican growth has been revised upwards from 1.8% this year to 2.6%. Nearshoring and reshoring are actually working. They're bringing home investment. There is a process of not decoupling, but de-risking and diversification away from China, and you guys see it on a daily basis here when you see the companies that are coming here. So let me just give you the example of, many of you probably know this already, but of Nuevo León, which is such an extraordinary success case for decades now in terms of building out its manufacturing capacity, its business culture, etc. But I would say that perhaps most importantly is that we have a governor there right now, a young man, Samuel Garcia, many of you know who he is, who was very much underestimated in the race for the governorship because he was young. I think he was 33 years old at the time. He's only 35 now. His wife is an Instagram influencer. She was the one that really helped him get projection to the state level. He's come in, and his whole attitude, his whole approach is actually to say, we need to work with the private sector. We need to understand the needs of business and manufacturing. And in response to that, we are going to come up with a master plan, a strategic vision for the state of Nuevo León. And that master plan for the state of Nuevo León includes things like building out the ports of entry into the United States, building out the highway infrastructure, and attracting major firms. And so the Tesla moment for Nuevo León and for Monterrey in particular is an extraordinary thing. The $5 billion that the Tesla are going to invest in that manufacturing plant in Nuevo León, in Monterrey, is just the tip of the iceberg. From that, another $10 billion will come in for investment for the suppliers. I was talking recently with people on Governor Garcia's team, and they were telling me, they said, it's just an extraordinary thing, but we have to forget it's not just Tesla, it's John Deere, it's other major manufacturers, and everybody wants to be here right now because this is the place to be. Everybody, including the Chinese. One of the most extraordinary things that I've seen over the past 3 years is that just northeast of Monterrey, in order to be close to the Tesla plant, over 300 Chinese companies have invested there. I was talking to a Chinese investor not so long ago in Washington, and they're the world's largest cell phone manufacturer. And they sell components to Tesla. And Tesla told them that for their North American manufacturing, i.e. for their Monterrey plant, they can no longer use components produced in China. They said, so if you want to continue to sell to us, you'd better invest in North America. So where do they invest? Just down the road from Tesla. So that's what they're doing. This is the reality of decoupling, de-risking, diversification, supply chain resilience. It's not just that governments are saying it, it's that companies are also telling their suppliers. And this is just going to be a wave after wave of business and political decisions that are going to happen here. If we just take a quick look at the master plan for the Puerto Colombia border crossing into the United States, yes, it's a reworking of the border crossing itself. There are dedicated lanes for Tesla, dedicated lanes for John Deere, so they just go straight through because they've already received that permission back at the factory, which means that you're going to see that as a very agile, fluid border crossing. But it's not just at the border. As we all know, if you fix the border crossing but you don't fix the highways and the roads and the rail connections, then you've only done half the job and you'll still get pile-ups there. So what they're doing is they're enacting, in fact, plans that have been around for decades to link together the highways of Nuevo León State, so that traffic moves more freely up to the port. And then on the other side, despite all of the conflict that Mexican border governors and the federal government in Mexico has had with Governor Abbott, they have negotiated with Governor Abbott so that Texas is now investing in the highway infrastructure on the Texas side of the border. That's an extraordinary thing, that you have a Mexican governor, 35 years old, who says, listen, think what you like about Governor Abbott, but we need him. So let's go and talk to him. Let's see about how we can work in our mutual interest. That's the kind of leadership that I think we're seeing in Nuevo León today, which is truly remarkable. Talk a little bit about Tamaulipas. Whenever you mention Tamaulipas, people are down on Tamaulipas because all they think about is the security problem and the fact that, to be honest, the state has underperformed economically for so long. If you look at the competitiveness index, which is on the left-hand side of the screen here, this is a report produced this year by the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, IMCO. You see that Tamaulipas is actually in 12th spot in terms of competitiveness amongst Mexican states. So it's in the top half. That's good. But of course, Nuevo León is in 3rd place, Querétaro in 2nd place, Coahuila is in 4th place, Baja California Sur, etc. Tamaulipas does not do well in terms of being a border state. It is the lowest ranked of all the border states. And a lot of that has to do with the public security situation, as we all know. However, if you go over to the right-hand side of the screen, and this is a report that has just been released, it's a peacefulness index that is produced around the world, and they looked at Mexico, and in fact, Tamaulipas comes 4th. It's the 4th most peaceful state in Mexico. Now, those of us who know Tamaulipas would say that does not sound right. That doesn't pass the sniff test, right? And there are a couple of explanations here. One is they're using official government data, but they're using that for all the states, okay? But the other thing is this, is that over the past 12 months, there has actually been a significant improvement statewide in Tamaulipas in terms of public security. We're still seeing unacceptable levels of crime and violence, but there is a positive trend underway. And if we can capitalize on that, and capitalize on that in terms of, yes, public policy, yes, public security policies, but also in terms of investment and economic opportunity, then I think we've got enormous hope for the future. Texas competitiveness. Let's have a look at that. And I'm sorry that the numbers are so small here, but in fact, if you look at the ranking, the top states for business this year, Texas is ranked number 6 nationwide. It is the 2nd best state in terms of its workforce. It is 24th in terms of infrastructure. It is 2nd for its economy. And then you look at the index for life, health, and inclusion, it's 50th. This gives you some idea of the challenges that we need to overcome. Just those 2 indicators, infrastructure, life, health, and inclusion, which are issues that business globally are looking at these days, we have to work on that. Money is going to come here anyway. But if we really want to take full advantage of the nearshoring moment, then we need to work on those issues. South Texas investments. You guys know this much better than I do, but I've found it enormously encouraging to see the kind of projects that are going on here in South Texas. Yes, the Port of Brownsville, which Eddie was kind enough to share with me recently, but the Alliance of Texas, South Texas cities. You've got educational investments. You've got an international airport. It goes on and on. These are things which are going to be more and more important, and we need to keep that kind of investment going into infrastructure, into these sort of really landmark infrastructure and policy initiatives. But also we've got to do the basics well. We've got to make sure that the border crossings are constantly being improved, not just in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of the protocols and the processes that people go through. We also need to make sure that we are investing in roads, railways, etc. Yeah, we now have, for the first time in history, a truly North American railroad. The recent alliance between Canadian Pacific and Canadian National?
Kansas City Southern.
Yeah, but what was the Canadian company?
Canadian Pacific.
It is Canadian Pacific. I always get confused between the two, sorry. I lived in Toronto for many years, and so they have the CN Tower there. I naturally go there. So Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern, that has produced a truly North American rail network. Now we need to have the infrastructure that links up to that. We need to make sure that we can get goods to market by getting them through rail, because otherwise we're not actually going to be able to take full advantage of the nearshoring moment. And I'll give you one example. Kansas City Southern constantly struggles with having sufficient rail cars to bring goods up from Mexico. It's a very simple thing, but they just can't get enough rail cars being produced. So we need to work on these aspects of logistics and infrastructure. Before I move on, just a quick word about the Port of Brownsville and the LNG project. It made me think. I always think of Texas ports as being headed for Europe. Of course, that's what they are traditionally. Now, they can get to Asia, but to get to Asia, they have to go down through the Panama Canal. One of the few major policy initiatives from the Mexican government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador with which I agree is actually the Transisthmus or the Transoceanic Corridor. So in the narrowest part of Mexico, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, for many years, in fact, going back to the times of Porfirio Diaz, it has been speculated you could either dig a canal or you could make a rail and road link. The government now is finally doing it. And the fascinating thing about this is that, yes, you could take goods from South Texas by boat down to Coatzacoalcos, take them across the rail link, onto ships in Salina Cruz, and get them to Asia in relatively short time, quicker than going through the Panama Canal, which, by the way, is experiencing all kinds of problems anyway because of low water levels at this point in time. So that's one of the things. Imagine now if you built a pipeline across there as well. So perhaps you could bring down LNG, you could regasify it on one side, pump it through the pipeline, reliquefy it in Salina Cruz and take it to Asia. Take advantage of those much higher gas prices in Asia. And then you think about what the government is actually thinking about doing down there, which is building out manufacturing capacity on either side of that rail and road link across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. All of a sudden, you have a new border with the United States, which is right there in southern Mexico. This serves the current government's purposes in many ways by really bringing them forward and saying, we're developing the south of the country. But it creates new possibilities for Texas companies to work with Mexican companies down there to be part of that integrated manufacturing platform for export to Asia. That's a very, very juicy prospect there. There's a lot of work to do, but the idea is fundamentally sound. Before I close, I want to talk about Mexico's election in 2024. When Andrés Manuel López Obrador won in 2018, he won a landslide victory. Control of the Congress, control of Mexican states, and of course, 53% of the popular vote. His administration has not been an unmitigated disaster. It has not been an unreserved success. Against all the odds, COVID didn't result in a complete economic meltdown in the country, despite the fact that López Obrador did not provide any kind of real public support for people or businesses during the pandemic. Despite his largely anti-private sector, anti-investment policies and attitudes, money has continued to flow to Mexico, largely as a result of nearshoring. So Mexico is currently receiving between $35 and $40 billion a year in foreign direct investment. Historically speaking, those are good numbers. I remember when I first moved to Mexico, we were looking at $10, $12 billion a year. By the middle of the 2000s, we were looking at $20 billion a year, and now we've doubled that. Experts estimate, however, that Mexico should be receiving double that, so between $70 and $80 billion a year. And the reason why that money is not going into Mexico right now is because of business unfriendly policies. 2024 presents us with a golden opportunity to change things. So on the left of the screen, we have the three potential candidates for the ruling party Morena. Marcelo Ebrard, Adán Augusto López, and Claudia Sheinbaum. In all likelihood, Claudia Sheinbaum is going to be the candidate for the Morena party. In all the polls right now, she's way ahead. She's very much the favorite of López Obrador, and he very much believes in the dedazo of choosing who follows on from him. And until about a month and a half ago, all political experts in Mexico and around the world said, well, whoever is the candidate for the ruling party is probably going to win the election next year. And then all of a sudden, a woman called Xochitl Gálvez burst onto the scene. A pan senator, born into an indigenous family in Oaxaca, grew up in poverty, alcoholic, abusive father. Her mother sold gelatinas in the traffic. What she did as a child was make the gelatinas for her mother to sell, pulled herself up by her bootstraps, set up a company in the tech industry, made a lot of money, went into politics, and became one of the most vocal opponents of López Obrador at the national level. She was going to run to be mayor of Mexico City, which meant that in his daily press conference, which begins at 7 a.m., López Obrador suddenly started saying things against her, criticizing her, accusing her of not being honest, of being corrupt. She demanded the right to reply, so she went along to his morning press conference one morning and demanded to be let in. And she wasn't let in, which was a fundamental political mistake by López Obrador. Now, all of the attention is on Ms. Gálvez. And as a candidate, at least, she's the real deal. I had the chance to have lunch with her a couple of weeks ago in Mexico City. She's an extraordinary person. She has the language of a sailor, shall we put it that way? I mean, she speaks the language of the street. But that gives her an authenticity that a lot of Mexicans really, really like. She doesn't just talk about poverty, she lived in poverty. She doesn't just talk about poverty, she has philanthropic ventures which actually help some of the poorest people in Mexico. She's a businesswoman. Whereas the president says, don't worry about making money, you shouldn't try to aspire to be anything better. Xochitl Gálvez says, in fact, you should aspire to be better because that's what makes us successful as a people, and Mexicans have always been like that. So here's the good news. Whoever of these four people ends up being the next president of Mexico, they will be much more business-friendly than the current president, López Obrador, there on the right. Why? López Obrador, as I said, won a landslide victory, controlled the popular vote, controlled the Congress, controlled the states. He has enormous legitimacy. He's very charismatic. He's a great communicator in the Mexican political culture. None of these candidates will have all of those things behind them. Xochitl Gálvez is a great communicator. She won't control the Congress. Claudia Sheinbaum, Adán Augusto, and Marcelo, they're not as charismatic as López Obrador, and they probably won't control the Congress either. Which means that whoever's the next president of Mexico, they're going to have to be more business-friendly because they're going to need to build coalitions. They're going to need to build alliances and partnerships, and they're desperately going to need foreign direct investment in their country. Which means that already they're beginning to listen to what it is that Mexico needs to take advantage of the new Mexican moment, of this nearshoring phenomenon. If we can get the federal government in Mexico to work not just with the US government, but with Mexican northern states to make sure that they have not just the energy they need, the infrastructure they need, the human capital they need, and if we can have that conversation in a cross-border way, the future is extremely bright. Not just for Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, but in fact for Texas, for Brownsville, for McAllen. All the way along the border, we will see opportunities exploding. So for the first time in, I would say, more than 5 years, I am extraordinarily optimistic. I'm optimistic about Mexico. I'm optimistic about the United States. I'm optimistic about Texas. I'm actually optimistic about geopolitics, even though it is a highly complicated time. How far we've come in just a couple of years blows my mind on a daily basis. Particularly when you live in Washington, you just get used to the idea that nothing's going to happen because of the lack of bipartisanship. All of a sudden, we're moving. And that momentum is something that we need to maintain. I would love to hear from you all now in terms of what your concerns are, your ideas are, how you're living the reality of this reshoring, nearshoring moment. And Roy, at the beginning, you talked a lot about reshoring. My own perspective is this: you can't actually have successful reshoring if you don't have nearshoring as well. That's always been the great strength for the United States, is having Mexico right there. Because there are things that you can do in Mexico that you can't do here. And there are things you can do here that you can't do in Mexico. It's those synergies that go together. So when you say reshoring, I'm hearing reshoring and nearshoring and ally shoring, etc. It's all part of a package, right? So I'd love to hear from you guys right now. And thank you so much for listening to me.